The song and the lesson aren't related in any way. You get a break from the hellfire and brimstone here for a few minutes, unless the Spirit prompt me otherwise. We've been spending some time here talking about how to read this book. We've couched it in terms of reading for depth versus reading for distance, and there are times when both are appropriate. We've talked about some things that you need to read for depth. Basically, what you need is to pay attention. Repeated words or phrases, images and emotions. Slow down. Take stock. One of the things I like to do when I'm getting ready to preach a text, my text for this morning was really 2 chapters long. Didn't read all that to you because it sort of destroys the preaching moment. But I told you what was there. Most of the time, I'll preach what preaching scholars call a literary unit of biblical thought. A literary unit of biblical thought. And we've talked about that. Your modern translations usually break up the letters into paragraphs, and usually those paragraphs are what I mean when I say those units of thought. What I like to do is take my unit of thought that I'm studying, and I like to copy and paste it into a Word document right in the center of the page, leaving a lot of margin on either side, 2 or 3 inches of margin on either side. And then I just like to interrogate it. I read through and I say, what does this word mean? Or why did Paul use this word? Or what's this phrase all about? Or I just ask all the questions, I highlight and I underline. And that helps me ask the right questions to get behind the text and into the story. Now, how many of you are avid readers? You just like to read novels and, yeah, a lot of you are. All right, let me ask you this. How many of you, when you're getting ready to read a novel, do you open up to the middle and just start reading? Anybody? You just don't close your eyes and take your big Harry Potter book and open up and go, I'm going to start here. What happens if you do that? Why don't you do that? That's the way you read the Bible. Oh, you see what I'm saying? Why don't you do that? Why don't you just open it up and just start reading? No context. None, right? You may come right into the middle of the story and you may be able to read the second part of it and know what's going on, but maybe you got some of the details wrong. Maybe you got the storyline wrong. Unless you know what goes on in front of it and around it, you're just going to kind of be lost. You don't read any other work of literature the way you read the Bible. Okay? How many times do we just open up and I'll start reading here? Now, I get that we feel like we already have some context. Okay? We do. We feel like, those of us who've been in the church for any period of time, we feel like we've got some context. But I want to share with you something that came up in my preaching class this week as a way to illustrate all of this. I want you to look at a passage in Philippians 2. I had a preaching student come to me, and this is an older student who's already been preaching for quite a while. And the way it works in my preaching class, I've got 21 students in there this semester. And so I chose 7 books from the epistles that I have preached through myself. So I think we got Ephesians and Philippians and 1 Timothy and 1 Peter and 1 John and James and the Sermon on the Mount. Did the Sermon on the Mount. That way, 21 students, I'll have 3 on each one of those books. That way we won't hear the same sermon 21 times. Well, this particular student drew Philippians. He's going to be preaching through Philippians. And he came to my office the other day and he said, I'm thinking about my first sermon, and I really want to preach this text, chapter 2, verse 15. That you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. He said, that's what I want to preach. I said, all right, tell me what you're thinking there. He said, well, our generation's crooked and twisted. when I'm going to illustrate how crooked and twisted it is, and then talk about how we ought to be better than that. I said, okay. Is that what Paul's talking about? I mean, this famous little line. I bet you've quoted this little line as you've read the newspaper or you've tried to explain to somebody else the mess the world's in. The Bible says it's a crooked and twisted generation. In what way? Oh, I know we can go to the headlines of the newspaper and we can see Olympic doctors molesting little girls and we can hear about wars and rumors. But is that what Paul is talking about here? See, it's one thing to just open up this letter and jump right into the middle of it and go crooked and twisted generation. What is Paul talking about here? Okay? Text without context is pretext. Text without context is pretext. You've got to understand what's going on all around. So let's see what we can do. You know, there are some questions that we introduced in the first part of this class that we ought to ask of every biblical text. Right? One of the questions is, what kind of literature is this? Well, what kind of literature is this? It's an epistle. It's a letter. It's a first century letter. Now, let me tell you some things about a first century letter you may not know. Number one, and this is the only point, they're all alike. Okay? Paul, John, Peter, James did not invent a new way of speaking to people when they wrote letters. They were just writing letters. Now, there are some distinctively Christian elements, right? All of these letters begin with the identification of the author. You know, we usually sign our name where in the letter or the email? At the end. Well, they signed their name at the beginning. So you'd have identification of the author, you'd have identification of the audience. Paul, an apostle, or in Philippians, it's a servant to the church in Philippi. So you'd have identification of the author, identification of the audience, the recipients, and then you have a greeting. Now this is where the Christian letters Christianized this greeting, grace and peace. Grace and peace. You know, when I write letters, I usually say something like, I hope you're well, right? Grace and peace is what Paul said. And then there was a preview. And for Paul in his letters, the preview is the preview of the letters where he tells you what he's been praying about. Grace and peace to you. I've been praying some things about you that I want you to know. And usually in that prayer report, you find out what he's going to write about in the rest of the letter. And then you get on to the body and the conclusion. Okay? All first century letters look like that, but Christians, like Paul and Peter and James and John, they Christianized, if you will, their letters. All right, there are some more things I want you to know about letters. In these letters represent Paul's authority or an apostle's authority where there's not an apostle. You know, Paul goes around establishing all these churches. How do they know what to do? What happens when questions arise? Well, fortunately, they had apostles that they could write to and say, hey, Paul. And in 1 and 2 Corinthians, there are several letters in 1 and 2 Corinthians we don't know anything about. In fact, there are actually 4 letters that Paul writes to the Corinthian church. And we know that because he references them. Okay? In 1 Corinthians, there's a statement in there, it's in about chapter 5, where he says, I wrote to you in my previous letter. Which means 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. Paul wrote an initial letter to them and they didn't understand it, so they asked some questions. How do I know they asked questions? Because beginning in chapter 7, he says, now about the things that you wrote, marriage. And then they ask about food offered to idols. And then they ask about the Lord's Supper. And they ask about spiritual gifts. And they ask about, and he goes trying to answer those questions. So there's a lot of correspondence there we don't know anything about, and we're trying to put together what's happening there. But here's the third thing. As we try to put together what's happening, there is no biblical writer that ever sat down and just put on paper a few biblical thoughts. There is not one book in the New Testament that is the result of a writer going, hey, I think I'll write about this today. When Paul writes a letter to the church in Philippi or the church at Corinth, he is addressing something going on in that church. He's writing to real people at real places in a real period of time, dealing with real things. He doesn't just sit down to put together a general treatise on salvation. He doesn't do that. He is responding to issues, questions, problems, okay? So, the genre of the epistle. It's a letter. It looks a lot like letters of that day. And letters of the day, just like letters today, have a purpose, right? So we ask a question about genre. We ask a question about author. We've already said Paul identifies himself as the author. Timothy's in there too. I don't know how much he actually wrote here. Maybe he was the guy that wrote this down for Paul. That happens in a lot of New Testament letters. Especially if we understand that Paul was of poor sight. He uses secretaries a lot to whom he dictates his letters. So maybe that's the role Timothy plays here. Maybe Timothy is familiar to this church. I don't know exactly everything that's going on there. But we have the identification of the author, and I want you to notice how he identifies himself in this letter. Paul and Timothy, what's the word he uses there? Servants? That's a different introduction than Paul typically gives. All right, so if I'm studying through Philippians 1, it immediately gets my attention that Paul calls himself a servant here, because usually he calls himself a what? An apostle. And sometimes he follows that up with, by the command of God, right? And what's he doing when he does that? When he reminds his audience that he's an apostle called by God or commanded by God, what's he doing? Authority. Yeah, it's about authority. You have to listen to me whether you like it or not. Okay? Devin, by the authority of the elders to the... No, I don't have any authority. Yeah. Well, apparently his authority is not in question in Philippi. He doesn't feel the need to defend himself. In Corinthians he does. In Galatians he does. In 1 Timothy with all these false teachers around, he does. Yeah, Galatians. To all the saints in Christ who are at Philippi. Well, I see that word and I start thinking about, what is Paul's relationship to Philippi? Anybody know? Where does Paul go to Philippi for the first time? Where? What'd you say?
I said he ends up in jail.
He ends up in jail there.
Upsets everybody.
He upsets everybody. That's part of the story, right? In order to find out Paul's relationship with the church in Philippi, you got to go to Acts 16. On Paul's second missionary journey. He ends up in Philippi by weird means. You know the story of the second missionary journey? What? Yeah, he had a dream of a man from Macedonia. Now, it's after he'd been trying to go back to Galatia, where he'd got stoned and left for dead a couple times. But every door seems to close there, and he has a dream of this man from Macedonia. So he hops on a boat and goes over to Philippi, and he finds out that the man from Macedonia is actually a woman named Lydia down by the river praying. And so he converts Lydia and her household, goes into town, keeps being followed around by this demon-possessed slave girl who's telling the future. And she's walking around after Paul and Silas and the crew and Timothy. And she's saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God telling you the way to be saved. And Paul gets annoyed by that after a while. Like Samuel asking me to buy him a computer. I mean, it's every minute of every hour of every day. And I want to cast the demon out of him, you know. Well, she's not telling a lie, but she's associated with demonic powers. And so when your hype man is a demon, you need a new hype man. And so he casts the demon out. And then the Bible says that her owners, how did they feel about that? They got mad. That Luke says, when they saw that their hope of making money was gone, right? They would charge people at the county fair to get their fortune told. You know? When they saw that their hope of making money was gone, they went to the magistrates and they said, this guy, our hope of making money is gone. Is that what they said? No, what did they say? it's treason. That's what we get in a lot of these places where they stir up trouble against Paul. They can't really stir up what he's done, so they make up charges. You're advocating customs that are unlawful for us Romans to practice. And so without a trial, they give Paul and Silas a good beating and put them in prison. And this is the famous story we know, right? At midnight, Paul and Silas were singing praises, and there's an earthquake, and the prison doors come open, and the jailer comes in, and having supposedly lost his charge, is willing to do the noble, honorable thing, take his own life. And Paul rushes in and says, "Don't do that." And he asks, "What should I do then?" And Paul says, "Well, I don't know what's going to help you with your Roman overlords, but I can tell you what you ought to do." And he preaches Jesus to him, and those people are baptized. And the next morning, the officials come to the jailer's house, and they want Paul to go away. How? Quietly. Quietly. We hope these text messages disappear. Quietly. Right? Why do they want him to leave quietly? Okay, they've got no case against him, for sure, but what else? Yeah, they find out he's a Roman citizen, and they have not given him due process. They have beaten him and imprisoned him without a trial, and he's got rights as a Roman citizen, and they want him to go away quietly, and he refuses. He says, "You want me out of here, you can take me by the hand and march me out." Why? Why does Paul make such a big deal of it? Probably had something to say. I guarantee you, Paul being marched out of town with a going away basket preached a louder sermon to the people in Philippi, because Paul is wanting them to demonstrate. What Kay, you're saying it?
More than anything he could ever say.
Right.
The visual part of it.
Because he was innocent. And he's going around preaching about a Messiah who was crucified like a common criminal, who he's proclaiming was also innocent, right? And so all of this stuff's going together. But all right, so Paul has a relationship with these people. We find out that no sooner does Paul get to Thessalonica than what does the Philippian church do? They send him money. Now this is significant because Philippi is the only church that sponsors Paul's missionary work. He doesn't take money from anybody else. Somehow from the Philippian church he will. I find out from 2 Corinthians that they are very poor. Maybe that's why he took their money. Because they were poor. It's a demonstration of their faith. I don't know, I'm just speculating there. But here's what I know. If I read all of Philippians, I find out in the very last chapter, look at the very last chapter. All right, let me ask you this before you read this. Why did Paul write Philippians? What is the occasion that has prompted this letter from Paul?
I think the overall purpose was Christ, to gain unity, oneness, joy, and peace in Christ.
Okay, now, your first answer, I think because of Christ, we could say that about any book in the Bible. That's very general. It's not wrong, but it's very general. Now, your second answer, to encourage them to unity in Christ, that's getting closer to the specific. But Floyd, what makes you think that?
Well, like you say, look at words. Just go through Philippians and underline Christ and Lord. And in the unity he wants them in Christ.
Yeah, so if you're looking at repetition of words, the number of times the themes of unity or togetherness or partnership or fellowship comes into play, yeah, that's right. Oh, and you find that in chapter 4 too, don't you? These two women, Euodia and Syntyche, are fighting. Okay, servant. He does. I wonder why Paul introduces himself as a servant in this letter. All right, let me show you. A lot of people, when they think about Philippians, they think about the part where Paul thanks the Philippian church for the money, right? Verse 10 of chapter 4. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I'm speaking of being in need. I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, how to abound. In every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Oh my goodness. We should have looked at this one as one that's ripped out of context. The number of basketball players with this on their socks. I can do all things. I'm 3'4", but I'm going to dunk that ball. Christ. Oh my. It really looks like that the occasion is this. The Philippians have sent Paul another check to support his missionary journeys. They've sent it at the hand of a man named Epaphroditus. Keep reading. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help. See, I didn't make that stuff up. It's right here in the text. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I've received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts that you sent. Okay, I'm putting the pieces together. Paul has been on missionary journeys for a while. If I read chapter 1, I find out that he's in prison now. And apparently Epaphroditus has come to visit him with a gift and also with questions. Like, now go to chapter 1. Hey, Paul, why are you in prison again? They're familiar with that. He was in prison in Philippi. And now they want to know. And I gather that they want to know because in verse 12 of chapter 1, he starts responding. Well, I want you to know that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Paul, you're in prison again. What's going on? He goes, man, it's great. Doors of evangelistic opportunity are being opened everywhere. So that, verse 13, it has become known through the whole imperial guard and to the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Well, who's this imperial guard? What's he talking about? At the end of the letter, he sends greetings from Caesar's household. So I get the impression he's in Rome, and the imperial guard is kind of the Roman guard there stationed in Rome. That makes me want to do a little research. Well, what about this guard? And I find out that typically a soldier who's working for the state there, they are attached to prisoners every 4 hours. They work 4-hour shifts. Every 4 hours, Paul gets a new